Just so you know, John, I'm going to have to record this. Do you approve?
I approve of this podcast.
My name's John Wilson. I approve of this podcast. All right, without further ado, well, welcome everybody to the Two Data Guys Big Corporate Show, where we talk about enterprise data challenges and the market trends in a tasteful, nerdy kind of way, sometimes with a hint of sarcasm, but always directly applicable and useful to our corporate data and analytics leaders. I'm Chris Johnson, self-described data aficionado. This year marks my 30th year as a technologist and a data practitioner. In that time, I've been an engineer, an analyst, as well as an architect. Along the way, I've had the opportunity to also be a leader and data executive in some of the most iconic brands in the world. So it's been a great ride, and I'm here to share all the goodness that I collected up along the way. The other half of the Two Data Guys is my good friend.
Sorry, I jumped on top.
That's all right,
Chris. I was so excited. So this is John Wills, and like Chris, 30 plus years in the industry as a data guy, as a data person. Right, I've been a practitioner. Meaning I've run some pretty sizable, consultancies and practices, but I've also been in software quite a bit. And been a leader of some of those organizations, but always in the data space. So all things data, 30 plus years and counting. Really excited to be back with all of you again. So I want to welcome all of our listeners. I think we have a really interesting topic today, which is a topic that's really exploding, which is around regulatory compliance, regulations. I think we're going to stick to mostly regulatory compliance as opposed to standards, but both areas which are super, super interesting. And I know this area of regulation, Chris, my everyday world is becoming quite challenging, for data people like ourselves. So I know that's really our topic. And as always, we're going to kind of go into three blocks, right? But I think before we do that, we can't skip our normal, our normal setup, right, Chris?
Absolutely not. So first of all, for those of you who don't think that standards compliance and regulatory discussions are sexy, we are going to blow that out of the water here today. We're going to totally change that. But before we do that, we're going to get to a section that we call What You're Reading, What You're Drinking, and What You're Watching. You're on point, John. What you're reading?
Yeah, well, I started a new book this week. I'm kind of into American history and, well, really all things history, but I've been really kind of focused on American history. So it's a book called The Patriots by Winston Groom, Adams, Hamilton, and Jefferson. And just, interesting tidbit, same guy that wrote Forrest Gump, right? So he kind of goes between fiction, nonfiction. So really interesting book so far.
Yeah, one of my favorite films. So that sounds like something I'd be interested in reading as well. What you drinking today, my friend?
Well, I'm actually not drinking it today, if I'm honest. I've got iced tea. It looks like this, but I'm really Evan Williams small batch bourbon 1783 is what I've cracked the label on, and yeah, really, really liking it. Not drinking it today, but we're getting close to Friday, so
I'm not sure that qualifies you for our what you're drinking.
I know. Yeah. I violated our first rule.
What are you watching?
Well, last time I said Perry Mason. I'm kind of a throwback guy, right? I don't know why, just am. So I'm really into the Midsummer Murder Mysteries. It's kind of a British murder mystery series, been on for 20-something years. I actually happen to like the early part of the series. So Midsummer Murder Mysteries. So let me bring it right back to you now. Before I let you comment, I could see you're opening enough to comment. What are you reading? What are you reading?
Well, just I gotta get my Midsummer thing, and we love it. My wife and I, it's a favorite. Really? Yeah, really nice. Good stuff. So, nice. Okay, so this week, oddly enough, what was really exciting and interesting to me was a 185 slide sexual harassment prevention guide that the HR team dropped on us, and it was very informative. Wow. It actually really helped me in preparation for some of the privacy work, because it's not just, didn't cover just sexual harassment, but regulatory, admission and management in general. So
you're the guy that said we were going to make this segment, exciting and sexy.
I think I use sexy, and I may be violating that.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. What are you drinking?
We have to edit that out. Today it is some delicious Elijah Craig small batch 1789 Kentucky bourbon.
Nice. I said 1783 and you said 1789. And that's interesting.
Just reading it off the bottle.
Yeah. What are you watching these days?
Yeah. So I just wrapped season 5 of The Last Kingdom. It's on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's this guy, Uhtred, son of Uhtred. And it's they take a lot of liberty on a lot of the early Nordic and English evolution of that time space. So just a great film. They left me hanging for season 5 for like 2 years, and then all of a sudden, oh, there it is. So just binged watched that and got done with it. So
awesome.
So let me tee up today's topic because I can't wait to get your take on it. We're going to explore privacy compliance and regulation. I think it's a really timely topic given the explosion of privacy regulations and the complexity surrounding how you implement those. For instance, I think nearly every company I'm speaking with these days has been impacted by some form of GDPR, Europe's General Data Protection Regulation. It's one of the toughest privacy and security laws in the world. Here in the U.S., California's Consumer Privacy Act is another great example. It's also known as CCPA. And I think that's likely set the standard for probably the rest of the nation. We'll see which states follow suit. But now, as always, let's take a look at this from 3 angles. And the first is, as data leaders, what do we think our obligations are to help our organizations or organizations in general comply with privacy regulations? John, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is actually, I think this thing we're going to cover in our second block, which is the complexity of what's happening. So we obviously have an obligation and a role in terms of complying. There's no question. I think the question in my mind is, where is that responsibility? What's the scope of that responsibility in terms of the rest of the enterprise, right? Because we have a very traditional, all the way from board, and sort of the board looking at, sort of the subcommittee of the board in terms of risk and governance. Then you have enterprise risk management, which has traditionally come out of the finance organization, and that is supposed to be a part of the organization that covers a whole diverse set of risk for the enterprise, right? And so some organizations even have a chief risk officer. Tends to be the more heavily regulated industries. And then you have data governance, right? So data governance, and you have all the other types of data management governance responsibilities like CISOs and security, network security, and all of that stuff. So I think we as data people have a role to play, but I think it has to be thought through carefully with the interplay between this whole chain of responsibility for risk and where the governance piece fits in. So I think that's my first point. Second point is, I think we're not really, we may have thought there was a time and a place when we could make the rules as data governance people. And I think other people thought we were supposed to make the rules. I think those days have kind of passed us by when it comes to privacy regulation. I think basically, as I'll talk again about a little bit more when we get to the complexity of this world that's exploding. But these are laws that have to be interpreted, and I think you have to get legal counsel involved. And I think legal counsel has to make decisions about the monitoring and the enforcement, for enterprise risk reasons. And so I think we have to take our lead from a lot of those decisions, right? So I think our obligation is to listen to those people and to be in line with how the corporation wants to handle risk, and largely it's going to come out of legal counsel. And then the last thing is, we have to be able to execute on that. We have to put monitoring in place, and we have to put classifications, and we have to put, all the types of reporting around that, right? All the great things that we really know how to do as data people. And we just have to follow through and do those. So anyway, those are my first thoughts regarding, our obligations as data people. What are yours, Chris?
So I think these are all really good points. I think the one piece before I cover off on some of my thoughts is,
Mm-hmm.
your notion of the guidance and the driving nature of our approach coming out of legal counsel. I think this is one of those areas that, frankly, I think so many people are expecting legal to be a far more prescriptive than they are. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
like everybody else, right, they're kind of having a hard time wrapping their head around what some of these regs mean. But
Mm-hmm.
um, for sure, we're obligated to understand, what is relevant, right?
Yep.
Regulatory impact for the industry we work in, and that's probably what they're struggling with for data folks. The more that we know about regulatory compliance, I think the better our design and architecture will be to align the business,
Mm-hmm.
first of all. But to get there, you need to know uh, company and governing body expectations, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it relates to our company data management
Mm-hmm.
practices, as well as those supporting systems, right? So policy and practice, great, but you have to digitize it at some point. And you're going to have a plan if you want to ensure that the measurement and the reporting on that compliance is
Mm-hmm.
going to be something
Mm-hmm.
that you're able to do well, because ultimately I think this is probably one of the big gotchas for us. Is it's one thing to digitize that governance and drive it into the systems.
Mm-hmm.
It's another to pull it back out and to do attestation and
Mm-hmm.
report. And here's how we are
Right.
compliant. And I think a lot of people get jammed up on that latter part, right?
Yeah,
So
for
so I
sure.
think it's definitely, plan to fail, fail to plan kind of thing. But in the end, you're spot on around CISO or CISO. I'm not quite sure. We may need a ruling on that. Depends on which part of the country I think you live in.
Probably.
But infosec in general, right, is
Yeah.
we got to make sure that we're aligned with their controls and security and everything else. So
Yeah.
this goes from zero to wicked complexity,
Right.
super quick,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Faster than Tesla, right?
yeah.
I wanted to comment on two of your comments. Just first of all, in terms of legal compliance, I think you're absolutely right in terms of, I think, the attorneys and legal counsel are struggling just as much as everyone else. And also I kind of felt like maybe my comments felt like it was a pass the buck type of thing. And I really didn't mean to imply that, if that's the way it came across. Um, the other thing is that I think that we almost have to do internal consulting in a sense, right, with all of these other parties that I mentioned, right, in order to because it's so complex. I mean, everyone has to come together, and I think we almost have to do internal consulting about the data world and what we can do, what we can't do, right, in just in terms of what's possible, right, and to help some of these other parties internally come to joint decisions. So that's my first comment. The second was I realized I kind of jumped to data governance as being sort of this responsible party, but I really think that what we've seen with GDPR specifically is that it's called out that you need to have a data privacy officer, you need to have a DPO, right, and that is almost called out to be a separate entity, within the organization. So, and again, here's a point that I don't think is completely settled down yet, but I think it for organizations that decide to have those as an independent, organization, then we as good data governance people or data people have to, broker this relationship, working relationship. Where's the responsibility begin and end, on both parties, plus some of these other parties that I mentioned in my comments. So anyway, just some other feedback there.
It's good feedback. The last bit on top of that, when as I think about what you're saying, is even GDPR and then CCPA, that's
Mm-hmm.
still, I mean, it's still emerging in terms of
Oh yeah.
what do we here in North America or LATAM or APAC think about that too. So yeah, it's always evolving and it's always
Hmm.
moving. But well, you know what that sound means. We
Oh
need
yes.
to wrap up our first block, and
Oh
I would
yes.
like to ask you, my friend, to provide an update for us from the Farmer's Almanac. So
Farmer's
let's
Almanac.
go to John at the farm desk.
Thank you, Chris. Well, at the farm desk this month, let's see what we've got on tap. We're in April. You know, one thing I thought for was particularly interesting for you, Chris, knowing your interests and habit is setting eggs by the moon sign. Are you familiar? Yeah, of course you're familiar with it. Setting
Why?
eggs.
Why?
So
Certainly.
the gestation period for a chick to hatch, right? Of course, we know it's 21 days, right? 21 days. And so, what we're provided with in the Farmer's Almanac is the ideal dates to set the egg. And of course, that means you take the egg and place it under the hen, right? Or in the incubator. And that
Doesn't it
gives
start under the hen?
well, I guess technically it does. But and if you do that, then exactly 21 days later, the chick will hatch and you'll have the most mature, fastest growing, most robust chicks.
Have
So
anything to do
setting
with
the eggs.
deliciousness at all?
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay. Didn't know. I thought
No
that I'd cover
comment.
that.
No comment. But apparently, so we have April the 14th. I mean, this is just kind of mark your calendar, one of these things, because we're a couple days off still. But don't miss it. Set the eggs on the 14th, right? So note to self: tie a little, string on your finger. You'll be good. All right. The other thing, I think we'll just leave it to one more quick update. I'm gonna skip the gestation and mating tables for this month, Chris. We're just gonna go straight to. I know you're in zone 3 in the country, and that's a challenging zone for
Yeah.
planting crops, but it's becoming an exciting time for you because tell you what, wheat spring. I think we talked about that last time. You're up
Yep.
for wheat spring, so you're good from April 7th through 30th. Get that in the ground, and then turnips. Also 7th through 30th. Your green light on turnips. So I think we'll leave it at that. I mean, collards, one of my favorites. You still got a month to go. You can't really go until
Dang.
I know May 15th, and if you boil them in the house, quite an aroma. So I do
You'll have
I do
you'll have
like
to send me the
greens, but
recipe.
I wouldn't recommend that.
We
No,
do
I
have
wouldn't
a
recommend that.
we do have a beet farm not too far from my place. Yeah. So
You
okay.
like
Well, now I'm
beet
a
with
little
a
bit
stick or red beets?
red beets.
Oh, just checking. All right, just
Yeah.
want to make sure.
Uh,
All right,
well,
so
I get
Chris,
it. Beet with a stick.
I
All
know
right. Now I'm
good
a little freaked.
cheesy dad humor. I know.
Why
I
don't you?
apologize.
Yeah. Why don't you help us out then? Because you did such a good job on that segment and lead us into our second block of
Yeah, I'd be
the
happy to.
topic, which is policy regulations.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I mentioned several times in my previous answer, more serious answer on topic, which was about this complexity that we're seeing. Part of the complexity, I think, around security and privacy regulations is related to jurisdictions. And you have countries, you have trading blocks, you have states in the U.S. All issuing their own regulations with their own requirements. And really, just the question, Chris, is really what are your thoughts on how we're supposed to deal with all this? How we're supposed to handle it? Right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
It's, for me, I've had a lot of time to think about this, given that I worked in a couple of industries. One is in the alcohol industry and consumer packaged goods, and then the other was in automotive. And between the two of them, especially like in the alcohol business, it's not uncommon to have regulatory impact at the county level per state. And if you think about the complexity of that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a great example is Texas. Texas has a lot of regulation, and every county does it slightly different. I think they're normalizing some of that, but
Hmm.
for the distributors and the manufacturers, and then like in my case, I was in the beer business and the brewing company, to be able to track and manage that is anything but trivial. So, um, in my mind, having worked in the field for a long time,
Hmm.
I think that I've learned to use solution patterns for these different things. One of those patterns that comes to mind is I always fall back to this notion of an inventory or a backlog.
Hmm.
So if you think about, again, let's use Texas and regulatory compliance for alcohol. Um, you can actually literally list those, and then
Hmm.
this is this notion of building an inventory, and then once you have that inventory or a backlog, if you want to use agile terminology, you can now prioritize that for the business, right? Because at some point, the business is going to have a lot of regulatory compliance and automotive. Some of that compliance far more important. Some of the
Hmm.
ecological like impact, some of the safety stuff versus some of the alignment with, steel hardnesses and things like that, right? So there's all
Hmm.
sorts of different levels of how important that is. So you qualify your backlog, right? And if you were to read, you talked about DPO, but anybody that has read through GDPR or CCPA, for example, more so I think in GDPR it's a lot further along and more well defined. And as fun as that sounds, you get a list of expectations. These form the baseline for your strategy, right?
Hmm.
So you gotta collect the stuff that you gotta manage, and you gotta look
Hmm.
at it in a holistic way, and then decide, okay, a lot of stuff here. What am I going to tackle first?
Hmm.
Right. Um, if you add to that any industry or expertise, sorry, or enterprise privacy
Hmm.
elements. So, for example, PHI in healthcare, or even PII, right, just really readily impacting a number of things. Um, Now you've got a really meaningful scope,
Hmm.
um, and and then lastly, I think that can be overwhelming. So
Hmm.
as you start to think through that, um, where's a good stop and start point, right? Anchor those core requirements. So here's my big list. Ugh, God,
Hmm.
there's no way I'm going to get it through. Here's my priority, and then even start to do requirements against that attestation or proving that, or being able
Hmm.
to implement or digitize that. And
Right.
once you start doing that, it really creates a very natural funnel in terms of where to start and how to get going. In the end, I think, this is kind of I don't know if this is something I necessarily recommend, but I think it happens. And I think
Hmm.
it's a natural byproduct as you funnel through your backlog. Oftentimes, much of the stuff that was on the list becomes obsolete by design. Things change, right? State
Hmm.
regulations change, governmental regulations, governing bodies, they're always creating new rules and regulations.
Hmm.
So that's the last piece is, get this backlog, get the requirements, but then don't gold plate anything. What is good enough, right? You always got to apply the
Hmm.
little that, I'm going to call it Tennessee windage in honor of my good friend.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. I like it. Well, I hadn't really planned on doing this, but I mean, you know, your discussion about inventory made me think about something. So, just as a tidbit or a suggestion for our listeners, a site that I've used for the past few years, International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAPP.org, and IAPP.org. If you go there, this is kind of a leading association for, as the name indicates, privacy professionals. There's a great resource center there. You don't have to have a login to get into the resource center. And you can see privacy legislation trackers. They have one that was done by an independent research company, and it kind of shows um, it's a matrix like you described, Chris. It kind of shows by country privacy regulation in force. The other one is a US state privacy regulation tracker. The thing I like about that one is it shows uh, it shows bills, state level bills that are in process. So it kind of can help you think ahead of what's coming. And I think the last time I looked at this, there was about 13 states that had legislation in process. I think, including California, I think there's 5 states that have standing. Well, let me rephrase that. California already has CCPA. They have another uh, regulation that's going to hit the beginning of 2023, and there's 4 additional states that have regulation that has already been through the legislature and is going to hit in the beginning of 23. So going back to my earlier comments about this is really exploding. Now coming back to this question about complexity. So how do you deal with all this? I couldn't agree more with your comments, Chris. And I really like. I had forgotten all. I've got just a little bit of you know beverage industry experience, alcoholic beverage level experience, enough to have dabbled in the complexity you described. And I'd forgotten about that. And so I'm actually going to make a note to myself to go back and look at that and see what's corollary to what's happening in privacy regulation, because I think there might be some really important lesson learned. I think my other comments around this really deal, I'm just compelled to say what I think how you do this, how you get down to brass tacks on this. And what it feels like to me is take your inventory list and you're going to take that inventory. And basically those are going to be the jurisdictions where you do business. And that includes your suppliers, your contractors, right? Anyone you send data out to for processing. It's going to have to cover all of those. And you're going to take your list, you're going to construct your list, use the IAPP site to help do that. That's going to be the list you're going to have to take around to these various groups internally that I talked about in block 1. And you're basically going to have to broker almost like a RACI matrix, right? Where you decide who's got responsibilities, accountability, is informed or consulted on each one of these. And so that's a lot of complexity. So pulling back a little bit, because I also, I'm a big believer in what you said as well. Like, how do you get really pragmatic and how do you just do something to move the ball forward? Because this is literally one of those areas you could get analysis paralysis. You could almost get locked up because it's so complex. I'm a big fan of taking that matrix you described and I just described and blowing that out to another level where you get really granular and you say, okay, for just a few of these items, let's decide on 2 or 3 pieces of data we're going to start to track. Let's say something simple like classification scheme, and we're just going to have classifiers on a few of these, right? Keep it super simple, but start something, move the ball forward. So really kind of get down to that first element that you can take action on, and then start exercising some of those muscles where you've brokered these scope and responsibilities cross lines or cross organizational boundaries. So anyway, those are my thoughts, Chris.
Yeah, great technique, and I love that you. We'll put a link up into the site that John referenced as well. A great example of that was when they started thinking in Congress and in the Senate in the U.S. About next generation HIPAA, and as they were passing high tech, right, they started planning and sharing the impact because they know that this regulatory impact is going to be in many cases non-trivial, right? It's going to have a huge impact on the industry and on businesses and economics and et cetera. And the other thing is you may find as you're starting to qualify that and pay attention to those those early streams of legislation, that some things you won't have to worry about. So like in high tech when they passed it, and I think it was 2018, much of it didn't get enacted till 2021, 2022, 23. So there's also some time bounds put on these requirements as well. That also helps you. And then the last piece, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's an outstanding technique when you talk about starting to use that classification, right, and start use categorization and other aspects of metadata management. So all these other things that we do in data management on a regular basis absolutely apply to these regulatory compliance issues
Yep.
and the business rules that we're going to develop. So that's outstanding. Listen, we could go on about this forever, but that signal is that it's time for this episode's $10 word.
Uh,
Um, yeah, so listen up. If you use the comments section below to add your definition of our $10 word, if we agree, we will flag that comment for untold recognition and honors directly from the Two Data Guys Global Enterprise Corporate Epicenter. In other words, a whole lot of ding ding, nada, rubber biscuit sound. Yeah, we have to add that in. But you will have our appreciation, and along with being signaled out for web trolls. The $10 word is it's actually a pair of. It's more of a $10
this is the second month
phrase.
in a word we did this. The second month in a row. It's
It's a
actually
$10.
not one word. It's
It's a
two words.
$10 phrase. Differential privacy. So let us know your definition of differential privacy. Good luck, everybody. And with that, okay, John, we've talked about obligations and how to
Mm-hmm.
deal with some aspects of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Do the regs have teeth? Are corporations trying to comply? What are your predictions for the future?
Yeah, predictions. Well, I guess I'm going to take it in maybe two different directions. One is the regs have teeth. I think uh, what I felt in the years, a couple years before GDPR, right? Especially being in the U.S. I think I was working with a very European-centric organization during that ramp up to GDPR time period. But I could tell, being a U.S. citizen, that there was a different standard of criticality or uh, importance, that was being given to it here versus in Europe, right? It was palpable. But that being said, I think it's still a fair statement that many of the organizations, other than the really highly regulated ones, I think those were super serious about GDPR from day one. The less regulated industries I was working with, I think it's fair to say, the thought was, let's do the minimum and see if this thing has teeth. Meaning, is anyone going to actually get prosecuted? Are there actually going to be any fines doled out? And so I saw a lot of organizations doing things like, all right, we're going to assign somebody who's already got a full-time job as the DPO, and we're going to keep a couple spreadsheets of records of processing, and we're going to call our existing data dictionaries our inventory of sensitive data. I mean, not saying those couldn't all be true things, but it was sort of trying to repurpose and, as I said before, see how serious they had to be about it if the regulatory bodies were really going to take action. I think since that time, my sense is that we've seen some regulatory action that's been pretty significant. I think Google, if memory serves me right, I think Google was one of those, and it was pretty serious, couple $100 million fine. I think that was last year. And there's been other legal action revolving around privacy regulation, even if it wasn't directly related to GDPR violations. You certainly see companies like Facebook on the hot seat on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of being heavily scrutinized. And so, yeah, I think there's some teeth. I mean, just to pull it back to the question, I think there's some teeth. I see companies now taking it much more seriously, starting to make deeper investment. You have people with real full-time jobs, doing this. You have a wave of automation that's going into place. So I think, yes, I think it has teeth. It's squarely beyond the could sit on the fence and wait and see mode. And all of this new wave of regulation that I described in our second block, right, is coming. So I would say, you definitely do not have the luxury to wait any longer. You have to start taking action and get things in place. Second part of my answer, I guess, Chris, is really taking a left turn, so to speak. And I mean, what's really on my mind is the need to really, we have to think about how to be transactionally, what I call transactionally oriented towards this. Maybe that doesn't express it quite well, but quite well enough. But let me give you an example, then I'll try to illustrate what I mean. We have this situation where you have all these jurisdictions. Let's say I'm a person sitting in Denver, Colorado, and I work for a parent company that's got legal entities that are in several countries in the EU, let's say France. And let's say I do some offshore data processing in Puerto Rico, maybe some offshore data processing in the Philippines, because it's cost effective, right, to do that sort of thing. And I run a part of my business, by the sun. So, I need that. All of a sudden you have a situation where there might be certain type of data that someone sitting, let's say in France, in a subsidiary wants to access that sits in Denver, but that data is also moved over to the Philippines overnight for processing and the reloading. So all of a sudden, if John Wills is sitting in France and wants access to the data, just making that request, even if it's done the old way, which is manually, and it goes through an IT sort of management, service system and ticketing and all that, there are still some really critical legal jurisdiction and compliance, privacy compliance questions and decisions that need to be made before that request can be fulfilled. So you get into all this nested complexity. So now coming back to saying, well, I think we need to think of it more as with a transactional orientation. I guess what I really mean by that is we need to get smarter about automating these rules. So we need to have requests that go in from certain people. Like I need to be able to recognize, where where the request came from, and the scope of the data and the physical location of the data where the data sits. There's two different jurisdictions with two different scopes, because for every one, you're allowed to bring it, you're allowed to push data in that direction, you're allowed to pull data back. And I think we need to automate all these rules, and we need to have, I just don't think we're going to survive unless ultimately we move to this highly automated sort of background processing that helps us with this, because at the volume of data that we deal with, at the rate of change with the data, and the demand of global business, especially in the largest multinationals, that's just going to absolutely have to be necessary to be able to survive and to be able to fulfill all these. I just don't think, the way we used to do it, a couple years ago in data governance, and sort of relying on, a single, threaded sort of stewards, even however many stewards you have, right, to move, to be able to answer all these questions and even monitor, we're not going to survive. So I haven't really done a great job articulating that, other than to say, on one hand, you asked me about teeth, and I think you answered that. And then predictions, my prediction or my prognostication is we have to ramp up our sophistication towards automating this. And now I know that's a long way from what we talked about in the second block. It's like start simply and just have a few things to do. And I still think you do that. But I think, you have one eye on where does this go from an architecture and scale perspective.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, you can't take your eye off the ball. But you bring up some great points, right? And this notion of decentralized regulatory application of the data, where it's working in the neighborhoods it lives in, right? It's running in this region, or it's running in this region, and I'm coming through from a different country with different privacy impacts, etc. It's really going to be interesting, right, to see how people solve for these problems. I think that, I want to go to teeth in a second, but I want to just talk about predictive perspectives. Is the other wrench in the system is this notion of the cyclic nature of government and regulatory compliance. I mean, here in the States, we have traditionally moved in this cyclic process of regulate, deregulate, regulate, deregulate. I do believe we're at a peak of regulation right now. So I think the risk is, if we're looking forward, that we overthink how to digitize and how to automate that, only
Mm-hmm.
to find that deregulation, right, removes some of that burden. But here we've built all this heavy compute and infrastructure and all of these
Mm-hmm.
things to process our data. So to the extent that we have great stewardship and we elevate, I think business rule processing engines, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we get them up off the deck, up off the data itself, and sitting on top in the business layer. I
Mm-hmm.
think to the extent that we can do that, we stand a chance of being able to not have to redo everything every 2 or 3 years.
Let
Having
me just be
Yep.
devil's advocate for a minute. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
yeah.
You sound like you're saying you think this could all be a mirage, and if we're at the peak of regulatory requirements, that somehow it could just go away. I
Yeah,
mean, is that really what?
I
Yeah.
don't think it ever goes away. If I thought about reg dereg, I think it's a stair step, right? So I think we're
Mm,
always kind of going up, but we're going to get into these. It's not really a trough because once we put this stuff in place, first of all, especially when it comes to personal information, PII, and data privacy, PHI, it was the right stuff for the right reasons, right? And
mm-hmm.
now, with this explosion of how much personal information people are sharing, and how much people or companies are collecting, and then the use cases for it, right? Some are using their powers for good, and others are using their powers
Mm-hmm.
for evil, right? Evil may be a heavy word, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get good practitioners and bad practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to see the pendulum swing from side to side. Now, in terms of how we approach that, I think what that means for us, if I can put my forward lens on, is that we need to make sure that however we're doing and driving this automation, we do it in a way that allows us some level of abstraction. So
Mm-hmm.
again, let's get a little altitude on it in terms of our architecture and design to allow us flexibility, because people, we hire people that do nothing but make laws. That's all they do. They sit around
Mm-hmm.
and they make laws. Well, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to make laws. They're going to pass stuff, and governing bodies like to do that. Even some of our professional governing bodies that we're members of,
Mm-hmm.
right? They like to think about things and
Mm-hmm.
and solve problems, and sometimes those problems really don't need solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, they're going to ebb and they're going to tide, right? Some of those things need to be dived in further, and other needs to be pulled back. So I think you're spot on in the devil's advocacy there. But having said that, it's we do have a long runway behind us of understanding that there is up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that needs to be part of the thought process going forward. I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you the other thing that I think um, is that when it comes to digitizing these things, um, there's a ton of investment into our space right now, into this space of data management and data governance, and I'm really encouraged by that. So, if these things, I think many of them do have teeth, and I think
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately to find out that they don't have teeth the hard way, somebody's going home, right? So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
don't want to take that risk. You want to be able
Yeah.
to be a good practitioner, and you want to make sure that you understand, again, what is the perspective from the business.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think risk assessment is really an underdeveloped skill set in data architecture, where you know we're gonna get a lot of pressure, in some cases feedback from the security teams and from the GRC teams and from audit, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
around, no, we have to do this or we could lose a lot. So I think about
Mm-hmm.
SOX, right? The CEO and the CFO are going to prison, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's some big things associated with this, but then if we think about the probability of that risk and how we
Mm-hmm.
mitigate it, you have to practice to get good at that. You have to
Right.
practice to look at fear and say, should I be frightened by this, or
Mm-hmm.
what's the probability that this happens? So start doing additional probabilistic analysis, right? This is where we can use all those analytic skills and tools that we have and start
Right.
building. I think this is happening now. I think there are even open data sets like NISC, right? And where people are doing that problematic, their probability assessments. Yeah, this is why you don't drink Elijah Craig before the show.
Probabilistic.
That's probabilistic, yeah. But you hopefully everybody in the audience gets my point. As these data sets start to surface, and as we start to learn how to do forecasting and probability, I think about Bayesian probability algorithms and all that kind of cool stuff, which is near and dear for me. You can use data technology to help with some of the forecasting of some of the impact of some of these things. So there's all sorts of different cool ways I think that the industry will try to solve for this. We've never had a shortage of cool and new tech coming out to try to fix the bad and uncool tech that we had the year before.
hence the word of the day, the two words of the day. Differential privacy.
Differential privacy.
So I'm teasing the audience a little bit, giving them a little bit of a hint as they go on their search. You know what that sound mean?
Oh, I do.
My favorite game of each of our episodes, and that's called Start, Bench, or Cut. And Chris, you know how we play this game. I give you three things, just like a manager on a team. You have to decide: are you starting? Are you benching? Or are you cutting that player, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I'm not very good at this game, but I'm trying to get better.
No, I think you're okay. So you warned the audience at the top in your opening. You said we can get a little nerdy. So my first one's a little nerdy, okay? But I really enjoy it. So my first three that I'm going to give you: start, bench, or cut. The data type, the integer data type, or the varchar data type. Start, bench, or cut.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty easy one for me. Varchar start. I'm going to bench integer, and I'm going to cut date data type.
You're cutting date. Okay.
I'm going to cut date.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I'm going to say on this one, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to start varchar. A lot of flexibility, but you run into a lot of data validation problems, which is kind of stinks, but a lot of flexibility. So I like the flexibility. All around utility player
Processing
on my team
is cheap.
I'm going with varchar. Right. Well, these days, right? I'm going to go with integer is the bench, and the cut is date. So there you go. You and I are in agreement. Amazing.
Fantastic.
All right. Our next one. We're switching gears, a little less nerdy, but still a little nerdy. Data lake, data mesh, or data fabric?
This is super timely for me because I'm about to do a webinar on data mesh and data fabric, so I can't cut those. At least case I can't do that until after I do the webinar. Data lake cut, absolutely.
All right.
Really overstayed its welcome. But yeah, yay. And
did it stay longer than Hadoop? Oh, sorry. Never mind. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we need some drum hits here. And then what I think I'm going to do is I think I'm going to bench mesh, and I'm going to start fabric. And I'll tell you why. Because in the end, I think that mesh is really it's much lower on the emergence spectrum in terms of what does it mean to people, right? But at the same time, when we go back to data lake, for example, everybody kind of is tired of knowing what that means.
All right, here's the way I'm going to call it. So data fabric, I'm going to start data fabric.
Yay.
Love the data fabric. Think it's really pragmatic today, and it can be done, and is being done by a lot of people. I'm going to bench data lake. I still have a little warm place in my heart for data lake, and then data mesh, just because it's so far out there. and it requires so much massive organizational change, process, and people and role change. I just don't think we're very, very far from making it practical at this point. But cool idea. Cool idea.
I
All
think
right,
it's cool.
last one.
Yep, agreed.
Last one, the final three. External data marketplace, internal data marketplace, or no marketplace. Of course, we're not defining marketplace. This is up to your judgment. We'll probably do another podcast on marketplaces. We'll define those. So just go for it.
Yeah, I mean, applying general usage of the term marketplace, I am going to start internal data marketplace. I'm going to bench external data marketplace, and it's close for me on either one of those. It depends on the organization and a number of things, but I am absolutely going to cut no marketplace. I just think that's
wow. You and I are really aligned this
we're
episode. That's amazing.
We're hitting
I'm
balls
exactly
today.
the same. I am start internal marketplace, bench external marketplace, and cut no marketplace. I don't see any way forward in the future without a marketplace. And anyway, we'll get into that in another episode. But great.
One day you're going to ask me about Brewers players.
Oh, I've been in that stadium. I love that stadium. They have great brats too. Great brats.
Exactly.
Okay, great segment on start, bench, cut. I love that segment. I think now, where are we at, Chris?
Yeah, well, I think it's time to get back to work.
Okay.
So we've talked quite a bit about this very complex and very heady subject with a lot of stakeholders. And they're going to have a lot of opinions, a lot of different ways to solve for things. But what's something practical? What's practical advice that you can leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I'm going to, great question. Practical advice. I'm going to go back to the matrix idea we talked about earlier, and then skinnying down the first steps you take down to the elementary, we would call the metadata types that you capture, whether, classifier, owner, purpose, right? There's some very clear, I think, pretty straightforward things you can collect from a collection and discovery process. So I would say start collecting those. And even if you take a look at like the EDM Council's CDMC standards, if you all don't know what that is, go to edmcouncil.org, look for cloud data management capability standards. There's some standards there for sensitive data and privacy. And so they suggest things like, have an owner field, literally an owner field on your data asset. So you'll have to decide, is that on the data source overall? Is it on each schema? Is it on each file set? Is it at the table level? You have to decide what level, but decide, have an owner. It's a single field. So I'd say start with a handful of those, right? Start exercising muscle. The second thing I would say is very pragmatic.
I love that, by the way.
Oh, thank you. The second thing I really like is, or not like, the second thing I'd recommend is you take those simple elements you're going to start collecting and now do two things with those. Monitor them in alert and measure and report. So monitor and alert. I oftentimes talk about this as bots, but that's, kind of maybe catches the imagination, or maybe it overcomplicates. But the idea is monitor it. Set a rule, simple rule on ownership, and something like every asset at the level you decide has to have an owner within pick a time frame, 30 days from the time that you inventory it, going back to what you talked about, Chris, inventory. And if it doesn't, someone has to be alerted. Who is alerted? You have to decide. Is that a steward that lives in the data governance group? Is that a DPO that lives in the privacy and control? But decide, right? That stretches and it makes you push into that RACI matrix. So now start alerting if it doesn't satisfy that rule. Then the last thing is to monitor and measure, right? So classic case, be able to create a query, right? Something simple that says, for this X number of data assets, X number have coverage of owners, and over what time, turn into a time series, right? Collect it all the time, and put it in a little data mart, a little data lake. And I'm tweaking you on data lakes there a little, Chris, but put it somewhere
I
and
love
start
me a good data lake.
and start having a little time series so you're monitoring. And so that's going to exercise these audit muscles. And so that would be my pragmatic, very practical advice for where to start.
I think that is a outstanding set of advice. So I really agree with a lot of that, and I think I'm just going to sprinkle a little around the edges on that. So we talked about getting to the bottom of the compliance story, right? What does it really mean? So it's kind of the long pole. You got to know it. You got to understand what it is. And risk makes for really strange alliances. So it can create fear. It can do any number of things that alter behavior the way that we want as a business to go forward. So in the end, you got to qualify what that risk is. You absolutely gotta, whatever those techniques are that you choose, and there's a number of different things that are out there, but make sure that you're qualifying the risk and your stakeholders are in agreement, right? This is what the risk of that compliance problem is. We talked. You just mentioned, this notion of automation, right? To the extent that you can automate governance, you need to get there as soon as possible. And if you hadn't made the right investments, you got to fix that. It's nearly impossible to do meaningful attestation if you can't measure it. Governing bodies know this, and so do auditors. So in the end, it leads me to my last, and that's more practical principle approach, right? So understanding that's very pragmatic to say, most people still don't understand what this means, right? So don't go over the top, don't push in, understand what's good enough. And then usually what the course of that attestation or how you're measuring that is a thing called a management action plan. Quick story. Every year when I was in automotive, right, we would have to come through and we'd bring in these, PwC and E&Y and the big houses to do audit for us. And everybody's hair got on fire, especially if we found that we had some either problems in control or whatnot. And it really stunned me when I first started learning, and I was just moving my way up in management, that this notion of a management action plan can be good enough. So let's say that new regulatory compliance comes down the pike, or a new governing body has a new rule that you must adhere to. Understand that it takes a while for everybody to figure out what is good attestation, what does good reporting look like. And in many cases, you don't have to solve for that. So you don't have to drop all your cool business investments, all the neat things you're doing to move to Graph. Hello, goodbye, Data Lake. So all of these cool things that you want to do, you may be able to continue to move forward with that. And simply by creating a management action plan, that's auditing terminology, right? That says, hey, I'm going to do this about that problem in this period of time. Every once in a while, you can buy yourself some time. So if you think that, I've got to be compliant for this particular aspect in 12 months, chances are that first level of compliance may be just saying, I'm aware that I'm of the regulation and I'm not completely compliant, but here's what I'm doing about it. Now check with your auditing team and the regulation for attestation, what that looks like, but very pragmatic, right? You don't have to do everything at once. So all good input. Anyways, listen, sadly, that puts a wrap on our discussion today. And I really did enjoy the topic. Is all our discussions, I learn a lot. So this is a lot of fun for me. I want to thank everybody for listening and remind you all that the next show, we've got a great, really interesting topic, as we normally do, but it's going to be who owns data, John, namely this tug of war between business and IT ownership, right?
For sure.
Going on for a long time. It's a hotly debated topic, and it will be here as well, with profound implications for effective data and how you use and share that with your enterprise. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're really looking forward to exploring that, and hope you join us for that discussion. Until then, this is Chris.
And this is John.
And bye for now.